Next, on the presidency, political science professor Michael Nelson explains how and why Richard Nixon's victory in the 1968 presidential election came at a pivotal time in American politics. That year was marked by the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. But Nelson describes how candidate Nixon worked to win over an alienated electorate to unite a country in turmoil. Hosted by the Southern Methodist University Center for Presidential History, this event is about 50 minutes.
The first thing a speaker wants to know when he's invited to speak at a different institution like SMU is who's going to be in the audience. Is it going to be 20-year-olds for whom the 1968 election is as remote an event as the 1920 election was for me when I was a college student? Or is it going to be people with a living memory of that election? And the answer, of course, was, well, it'll be a mix of people, which was no use at all, but it enabled me to think about a way to pitch this talk, if you will, and that is to make some general remarks about the election and some specific remarks about the election, but also to give you this handout, which is a kind of menu for things that if I don't talk about them in my prepared remarks and you have an interest in pursuing and hearing more about, you'll have the opportunity to do that in the question and answer. So I'm not going to try to give you a comprehensive summary of my book, which is not only about the '68 election, but the years leading up to that election and the years that followed that election. But rather, I'll try to hit some high points and rely on you to decide what you want to hear more about. America coming apart. America coming apart has been the theme of most commentary on politics in 1968, both at the time and in what is now the nearly half-century since that year. The titles of the leading books about this period, the period in which the 1968 election occurred, convey this theme of America coming apart. For example, a book titled America Divided, The Civil War of the 1960s. A book titled The Unraveling of America. A book titled The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, with hope morphing into rage as the decade unfolded. The theme of my book is different. Not America coming apart, but America holding together. Not America coming apart, but America holding together. Now, I'll return to that theme later in my talk, but for the moment, let me acknowledge just how great the strains on this country were in that year. Think about some of the events that occurred in 1968, starting at the end of January with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which severely undermined public confidence in President Lyndon B. Johnson's conduct of the war. The war in Vietnam was a war that President Johnson inherited from President Kennedy, but continued and escalated. And in late 1967, on the eve of the year in which the election I'm talking about took place, Johnson and other leading figures in his administration went around the country on what they called a success offensive, making the case that we had finally turned the corner in Vietnam, that success was near. And then on January 30th, which in Vietnam that year was the start of the New Year. New Year's in Vietnam is kind of like Thanksgiving in our country. The specific date varies from year to year. In 1968, it happened to fall on January 30th. And because it was a holiday and because there was a widespread understanding among at least the South Vietnamese that a ceasefire would be in place at least on a de facto basis, a lot of South Vietnam soldiers went back to their home villages and neighborhoods to be with their families. The North Vietnamese, with the assistance of the Viet Cong, which was the communist force within South Vietnam, took that occasion to attack in a way they never had before the major cities of South Vietnam, including Saigon, including for a few hours even occupying portions of the American embassy in Saigon. Now, almost everybody who has studied the Tet Offensive militarily has concluded that it ended up being a major military victory for the United States and its South Vietnamese allies. But the facts on the ground could not compare with the psychological effect of the Tet Offensive, which was to undermine the idea that the communists were out of gas, that they were on their last legs, and that the war was drawing to a close. By March of 1968, the popular challenges to President Johnson's renomination within the Democratic Party by first the anti-war Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, and then Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, which ended up triggering the president's withdrawal from that election. McCarthy had been persuaded to run against Johnson, to challenge Johnson for the Democratic nomination in the fall of 1967. He wasn't getting anywhere until the Tet Offensive and until the New Hampshire primary, which took place in mid-March of that year. If that's for me, I'll call them back. In mid-March of that year, in which McCarthy, kind of like North Vietnam and the Tet Offensive, didn't defeat Johnson in New Hampshire, but came so close to defeating him that it was a psychological victory. And then a few days later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York enters the nominating contest as well, which was Lyndon Johnson's worst nightmare. There was an incredible dislike between Kennedy and Johnson, a visceral dislike, a chemical dislike. And Johnson had spent his entire presidency thinking that Senator Kennedy was just waiting for an opportunity to drive him from office. This was his worst nightmare. He even had nightmares about this prospect. And now this worst nightmare was coming true. And by the end of March in 1968, and some of you will remember watching this speech, primetime network television. This was the days when there were only 3 networks, and if a president gave a speech in prime time, that was all that was on. So the nation was watching President Johnson on the evening of March 30th, giving this speech about Vietnam, which ended with his statement that he would not seek nor would he accept the nomination of his party, which took the country entirely by surprise. In April, just a few days after Johnson's withdrawal, and in my city of Memphis, Tennessee, occurred the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King, and in the aftermath of that assassination, rioting in over 100 American cities. So much so that Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was in New York at the time these riots broke out, was told by the Secret Service, "We can't take you back to your office on the Senate side of the U.S. Capitol, and we can't take you back to your office in the Executive Office building adjacent to the White House, because the rioters are so close to the Capitol and the rioters are so close to the White House that we can't assure the safety of the Vice President of the United States." That's April. In June of 1968, the assassination of Senator Kennedy on the night of his greatest victory in the California primary. And the story about that is that Kennedy, having appeared on national television to celebrate victory in that primary, decided to do something different from what he usually did. Usually when Kennedy would make that kind of appearance, he would exit the hall through the crowd. And his security people had begun clearing a path through the crowd. Well, he decided that night that he was going to go talk to the assembled press. And the quickest way to get there was to go out not through the crowd, but rather through the kitchen, where there awaited a young Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan with a .22 pistol in his hand, who shot and killed Senator Kennedy that night. And of course, in August of 1968, when the Democratic Convention gathered in Chicago, the worst rioting ever to attend a National Party convention in American history, rioting that again was carried to the entire nation over the network broadcasts. Extraordinary violence, extraordinary turbulence, extraordinary sense that if major political figures were were dying at the hands of assassins, if a major political party could not hold its convention in peace, surely America was coming apart at the seams. And of course, all year long through 1968, the simmering anger that attended the third party candidacy of former Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, which always seemed to be on the threshold of breaking out into actual violence. 1968 was, by any reckoning, a turbulent year. Now, I've talked about the Democratic side of this. The Republicans, meanwhile, were conducting a fairly conventional contest for their party's nomination, in which the three major contenders ended up being Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York. What an unlikely character he was. A third-generation Rockefeller. When he was born, his birth was announced on the front page of the New York Times. But who ended up spending a career in public service, and then at some point in the 1950s decided he actually wanted to go out and ask people for their votes, and ran for governor of New York, and turned out to have a wonderful sort of common touch. The novelty of seeing a Rockefeller eat a hot dog on a street corner in New York City was just arresting. And Rockefeller was elected governor in 1954, 1958, re-elected in 1962, re-elected in 1966, and played a kind of Hamlet role during the first few months of 1968. Will he get in to the contest for the Republican nomination, or will he stay out? And initially, he threw his support behind somebody whose last name you may recognize, but whose first name may come anew to you, and that is Governor George Romney of Michigan. Rockefeller sort of anointed Romney to be the candidate for the Republican nomination who represented his sort of moderate liberal northern wing of the party. And Romney, much to his embarrassment, confessed early in the campaign, confessed to a local television interviewer that he had been to Vietnam in 1965 and received the greatest brainwashing that anybody had ever received from the generals there. And instead of being taken as sort of a confession of regained wisdom, he had come to realize in his view that the war was hopeless. Instead, this brainwashing remark got taken as sort of a synonym for a lack of intelligence to begin with. And the serious criticism was, how long does it take somebody to get over a brainwashing? So Romney was out, Rockefeller got in. Meanwhile, over there, I guess I should indicate your right, the right wing of the party, was this new figure on the national political scene, even though he was fairly well along in years. This former screen actor, very successful screen actor, by the way. People tend to write off Ronald Reagan's screen career as if it were amateurish. I remember there was a New York Times review of Reagan back when he was the fifth leading box office star in Hollywood one year, by Bosley Crowther, the movie critic for the New York Times, who wrote, he has a nice way of looking at a dame. That was Ronald Reagan in terms of how he made his living through most of his career. But Ronald Reagan, after his film career came to an end, had started working for a company you've all heard of, General Electric, which had plants and factories and other facilities in 38 out of the then 48 states. And Reagan was hired to go around from plant to plant and address the workers, and the expectation, I think, was when he was hired that he would tell sort of inside Hollywood stories. But instead, he adopted, in a serious way, the kind of pro-business conservative ideology of his employer and started giving very serious political speeches, and ended up being the Republican candidate for governor of California in 1966, and enormously successful in that role. Now remember that in the 1964 presidential election, the conservative wing of the Republican Party had had its way in choosing the nominee that year, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, and he was defeated overwhelmingly by President Johnson. So conservatives were looking for somebody who could carry that message, but in a more appealing way. And that person became Ronald Reagan, elected governor of California in 1966. And for conservatives in the Republican Party, who then were a wing of the party, rather than, as we've come to see, virtually the whole party in our day, Reagan became the new champion. Well, who else was there in 1968 on the Republican side? Former congressman, former senator, former vice president, former defeated presidential candidate, former defeated candidate for governor of California,